passage to Skagway. And as we can recall, Skagway wasn't the home of the Klondike Gold Rush, but it was the gateway. And to see where the Klondike was, well, we just have to go all the way up here to this big red blotch. That is Dawson City and the Klondike Gold Rush. As we know, Alaska's a pretty big place, so this is a significant distance, which brings us to the two trails that individuals had to take. That's right. We had the Chilkoot Trail on one side, which was 27 miles of basically straight up and down and into Canada. On the other side, we have the White Pass, which was roughly about 45 miles of up and over and in. But here's the thing. During the Gold Rush, both of these trails would eventually get two very different names. On the one side, the Chilkoot Trail, well, it would eventually be called the Golden Staircase. Glamorous, right? Sounds like it. And in reality, though, it was vastly different. The Golden Staircase refers to actually the final bit of the trail, which was a 1,000-foot ascent in less than half a mile. A near vertical climb carved basically out of the mountain face with pickaxes and shovels. Now on the other side, we had the White Pass, which was heralded as the easier route and the wider route, and you could in fact bring pack animals to carry your supplies through the pass. Here's the thing, by the end of the Gold Rush, this trail actually eventually got called the Dead Horse Trail. And in fact, there are a number of records that state that 3,000 pack animals lost their lives to this trail alone during the Gold Rush. In fact, some of those records say that you could actually smell the trail all the way back in Skagway. Now, those trails obviously were intense, but of course before that, you had to first survive Skagway. And Skagway back then was ran like a theater of cons. So I'm going to take you through a stroll through the streets of Skagway for a moment so you can get an idea of what this boom town was like during the rush. What you need to know is, well, Skagway almost exploded overnight from a sleepy little outpost to a town of 8,000 to 10,000 people, which at the time made it the largest city in Alaska. And its main street, well, it wasn't lined with pretty sidewalks or schools or even a proper jail. What it did have, though, was a saloon every 20 feet, a brothel every block, and, of course, a general store which doubled as the courthouse. And, in fact, to give you the perfect picture, I'm going to describe a moment in time when the Canadian Mounties had actually sent one of their own into town to survey Skagway and determine what kind of individuals were leaving Skagway and actually coming into Canada. And that Mounties report, well, it came back and said that Skagway was just a little better than hell. He said that at night, the clash of dance hall music, well, it mixed with the crackle of gunfire, screams of murder, the desperate shouts for help. And in closing, he said Skagway was quite possibly the roughest place he had ever been. It's a direct quote, folks. You can find that report online if you want to. But of course, good would prevail and Skagway would eventually get cleaned up. But it wasn't just the town that would get the facelift. No, the trails would as well. That's right. Engineers would later carve a narrow gauge railroad through the White Pass, and it came to a completion in 1900. It's actually the same railroad that takes tourists actually through the White Pass now today. Anyway, but back then, though, the railroad really was an engineering marvel, and it gave these would-be miners a much easier route through the pass. The only problem was, by the time it came to completion, well, the Klondike Gold Rush was actually starting to wane. So that meant there was less and less gold coming back, and less miners actually going through the pass. So, what does one do when the second largest gold rush in North American history starts to come to a close? Well, these folks really had one of two options. Well, they could continue to try their luck and head even further north to Nome, and some did, roughly around 10 to 20,000 people. But others, well, they were a little less confident. So they decided actually to head down south. Problem was, a lot of these people, well, they were embarrassed. They had traveled all this way up north and they hadn't struck it rich. So before they got all the way back down to Seattle, well, some of them started seeking some shelter in the storm. This leads to a lot of folks ending up in a town called Ketchikan. Ketchikan explodes around this time. All these people heading south end up in and around Ketchikan Creek. And remember, the town's not built out of a rush. In fact, for a while, it was just a rough little settlement hanging to the creek and the salmon that ran up it. But it does become known for something during this time. It is identified as Alaska's first city. I'm sure you'll see this sign when you get to town. I mean, they're not hiding it. It's certainly right up front and center. And it's the only route you can actually take into downtown. So you're going to go right through there. Highly recommend. It's a very popular spot for a selfie. But the thing is, this is probably bringing up some questions because, I mean, if you've been paying attention at all to this presentation, I mean, we've already been to Sitka, we've already been to Juneau, and we've already been to Skagway. These were all towns ever before Ketchikan was even a thought. So, how does Ketchikan become known as the first? Because it certainly is not chronologically. But it is first for many tourists. I mean, not us, obviously, but for many of them. The city is the largest southernmost city in Alaska, and for most travelers traveling by boat like us, well, it is first on the map. So it is first geographically. So don't let them tell you in Ketchikan that they were the first city in Alaska ever, because that is not the case. What they are, though, is the first place that many folks step foot in Alaska for the very first time. But that is not all that Ketchikan is known for. Despite not having a rush, they do have a boom. I mean, two in fact. One for salmon and then one for timber. The thing about salmon, well, unlike gold, well, they come back year after year, season after season. So you don't have people, thousands of people rushing into town and then leaving just as quickly. No, you have people stay. They build homes, they build docks. They really do build a routine in this tiny little southeast Alaskan town. Then the timber boom hits, and people begin to pour in again. They come fast this time. We're talking workers, loggers, opportunists, people looking for steady money and a good time while they're at it. And the town really does meet this demand. And in fact, during this time, it is said that you could actually get fired from 2 jobs in Ketchikan in 1 week and never miss a day's work. One thing in particular during this time explodes, and I'm talking about the bars and the saloons. Trust me, when you get to Ketchikan, you'll notice something. There is a heck of a lot more bars and saloons than every other town we're going to be visiting. Now, the thing about these bars, though, is, well, back then there was about 1 every block between the docks all the way to the lumber mill. So, and the best part about these bars is, well, they only had to close between the hours of 5:30 a.m. and 6 a.m. So just 30 minutes. So a lot of these loggers would step out for a smoke. The bartender would wipe everything down, and then they would come back in and keep drinking. So a lot of these loggers, well, they would actually just do the bar crawl all the way to work every single morning. Ketchikan is one of the more lenient liquor laws, and Alaska leans on the cities to make a lot of those. And again, you'll notice that when we get to town. That leads to a bit of a reputation, though. Now, take everything I've shared with you, the timber boom, the money, the crowds, the bars stacked one right after another. Eventually, people start to talk. And actually, a number of news articles come out around this time about this tiny little southeast Alaskan town. They don't call it by name. In fact, they call it the wickedest city in Alaska. Some of these articles even call it the wickedest city in the United States. And to understand why, well, you don't have to go very far when we get to town. You just have to wander down to Creek Street. Now, Creek Street today is charming. You got the boardwalks, the colored buildings, and of course a couple places to take some great pictures. But back then, it was the heart of it all, especially during Prohibition. But it wasn't just alcohol. Ketchikan Creek was home to a thriving red light district. Not one hidden, not one whispered about, one that was just actually embraced by the town, at least for a little while. That is because it came to an end very quickly. It was shut down when the laws were changed. So almost overnight, all those brothels, well, they were closed and enforcement actually increased. But here's the thing. Ketchikan isn't a town that hides its past. In fact, it builds right on top of it. Here are some of those leftovers. You can see on Ketchikan Creek, you still have those same colored buildings, those same boards hanging over the water. Only now, those buildings are shops and museums that celebrate the town's history. Of course, there is still Married Man's Trail, which is exactly what you're imagining it is. It is the route that is on the backside of Creek Street that all those gentlemen that were married would take down to the bars and brothel when they didn't want their neighbors to see what they were doing. Or worse yet, their wives. But that's not all that got left in Ketchikan. Ketchikan's ingenuity that supported the booms and the bus can be seen almost everywhere, even in the sky. Now, most of you folks aren't going to know what I'm talking about when I say the milk run. But the milk run is famous here in Alaska, and it all started right there in Ketchikan. I'm not talking about milk being delivered to your back doorstep. I'm talking about milk being delivered to your remote cabin 3 islands over. Because as aviation took hold here in Alaska, it became a massive part of our lives. Trips that used to take months now would just take just a few hours by plane. And well, back then it started with float planes, but now it's carried forward by Alaskan Airlines and their big commercial jets. As you can see on this image here, the milk run starts in Seattle, makes its all the way up to Anchorage, and has a number of stops along the way. And it's not just carrying people or passengers, it's carrying mail, it's carrying supplies, it's carrying the basics of everyday life. Now, is it the most efficient route? I mean, probably not. But it is a quintessential part of our Southeast Alaskan life here. And thankfully, well, the views aren't that bad either. And of course, if we're talking about flying, and if we're in Ketchikan, we need to talk about the Bridge to Nowhere. Has anybody ever heard of the Bridge to Nowhere before? I see a few hands here. Okay, for those of you who don't know, it was a pretty big story from when one of our old governors decided to run for federal office. Not naming any names. Anyway, basically what you need to know is, well, Ketchikan's airport is on an island. An island is actually reached by ferry and not by car. This same politician, well, they convinced Congress to partially fund a project that would bring a bridge to Ketchikan, connecting the airport to town. Now, I say partially pay for it, but the feds really did fork over roughly around $600 million. Now, I need to emphasize here, there really is nothing on that island except for the airport. There's no people, no parks, no homes, just the airport. So the slogan, the Bridge to Nowhere, began to take hold. Fortunately for us, well, the project would not. The only thing is, well, the funding from the federal government, well, it had already been spent. And it was earmarked for bridge infrastructure. Let's be real. We didn't want to send back $500 million. So, true Alaskan style, instead of building a bridge, what did we do with that money? Well, we took half of it, we built a road from the airport all the way to the southernmost point of Gravina Island. Took the other half, and we built a road from the airport all the way to the northernmost point of Gravina Island. So, instead of having a bridge to nowhere, Ketchikan now has a road to nowhere. That is, unless you consider a really pretty picnic spot as a destination. So, folks, that story actually brings us to the end of our journey. From all the way from prior to the Russians all the way to today here in Alaska. I want to thank you for joining me, but the journey doesn't have to end there. There still are a number of different stories that you folks get to hear about, and if you want to read about them, there's actually a set of books being available at Calypso Cove over on 4-6 in the center of the ship.